My husband blocked me, left me, drained my bank account, but no one expected my revenge. I never imagined that a careless read message and a phone block could be the first signs of the earthquake that would destroy my world. He left the house as if going to the store. In reality, he was locking away an entire life, mine, and taking with him not only empty promises but also our money. What he didn't know was that, by trying to bury me, he had planted the seed of my freedom. And what I was about to reap was not blind rage, but strategy, courage, and a revenge with the taste of rebirth. My name is Anna. For 12 years, the house we shared was my refuge, but also the stage of small compromises I hadn't even noticed. We worked, paid bills, dreamed, a car, a vacation home, our children's education. Everything seemed normal until one morning, I needed to transfer money to pay the car installment. I opened the app and my account was empty. Panic set in. I called him, no answer. Messages. After dozens of attempts, I noticed the final silence, blocked. Not just on the phone, he had deleted me from social media, family groups, and worse, had transferred almost all our savings to accounts I didn't know. He took what kept us together, or at least what gave me security, and left a cold signature, "Don't contact me." The shock turned into emptiness. Some might expect that, when betrayed, the first reaction is to yell, run, or beg. Mine was different. I breathed deeply and decided to think. If he wanted to destroy me, I would rebuild, with intelligence. The first days felt unbearable, but I had to be practical. I avoided public scenes. I didn't want my children to see their mother in pieces. I consulted a lawyer who explained the basics. Some assets could be recovered, suspicious transactions could be frozen, and a bank investigation could be requested. It wasn't simple, but it was possible. I went to the bank. The lines seemed shorter than my fear. They opened a protocol, requested documents, and promised an investigation. While waiting for formal responses, I began gathering proof on my own. I felt there were things beyond money, secret accounts, deleted emails, late-night calls. I decided I needed to understand everything he had tried to erase. With the help of a friend who worked as an administrative assistant at an accounting firm, I tracked transactions and messages linking to another person's card. I discovered that the market was often a cover for secret parties, expensive hotel stays, and gifts for women who weren't me. Each discovery was a cut, but also a confirmation I wasn't imagining things. He was deliberately cheating. Revenge, for me, wouldn't be a public scandal or cruel exposure. I wanted him to lose what he sought to gain with his betrayal, my submission, our family's peace, and impunity. I planned something careful, legal, and devastatingly effective: recover my money, reclaim my dignity, and ensure he faced consequences for his choices. Step 1. Security. I changed passwords, updated accounts, and requested temporary blocks on any cards in my name. Step 2. Documentation. I collected statements, screenshots, emails, and witness testimonies. Step 3. Strategic exposure, not humiliation, but accountability in the right place: his workplace, financial institutions, and where it mattered socially. Meanwhile, I silently rebuilt my network, told my sister and a few close friends, seeking emotional and logistical support. I didn't need applause, I needed allies. What no one expected, not him, not the women he was fooling, was my surgical calm. I used the information I gathered to hit 2 critical points: his employer and the bank. At the bank, I requested a detailed audit of joint account transactions, citing suspicious activity and alleging misappropriation. Simultaneously, I arranged a meeting with HR at his company. I brought copies of transactions linked to personal expenses incompatible with his income and showed how it could create a reputational issue for the company if exposed. The company acted. They opened an internal investigation. He realized too late that his behavior had a cost. There were no initial public confrontations, just doors closing on him, contracts reviewed, and cautious glances replacing former complicity. At the same time, I managed to block some pending expenses and request partial reimbursement to a judicial account, enough to cover the children and basic bills. Not all the money, but a start. And most importantly, the legal machinery began to turn. He tried to control the damage with arrogance, threatening, bargaining, calling mutual friends to explain the situation. When he realized no one would protect him, he attempted a show, appearing at a family gathering asking for forgiveness, claiming it was a temporary mistake. But I had already planted the seeds of my own power. Instead of confrontation, I calmly presented documents to the family, not to humiliate, but to clarify. I showed what I had, explained the legal steps I had taken, and said firmly, no cheap revenge. I want justice and security for my children. Masks fell. Friends who once covered for him began distancing themselves, and his social network began to shrink. He became isolated, a consequence as effective as any public exposure. With some money recovered and legal assistance ongoing, I went further. I restructured the household finances, negotiated deadlines, sought advice from a financial consultant, and opened a separate business account to operate independently. I learned basic investments, collected evidence for future proceedings, and set clear boundaries with banks and creditors. At the same time, I cared for my soul. Therapy, rekindled friendships, and resuming an old course I loved. The rebuilding was slow, but restorative. True revenge is not about destroying the other, it's about reclaiming yourself so the other loses power over you. Months later, the bank confirmed irregularities. They proposed a partial restitution, and his employer took disciplinary measures that affected his career. Civil proceedings for misappropriation ensured stability for my children and me, alimony, partial reimbursement, and compensation for moral damages. The process was painful, reopening memories I'd rather forget, but liberating. Every document was a victory. I felt strong not from vengeance, but from defense, protecting my family and my future. He paid a price, lost reputation, some assets, and the trust of those who once protected him. I didn't celebrate his ruin, I felt clarity. My victory wasn't animosity, it was justice. I regained more than money, I regained autonomy. I worked, studied, and planned. Fear was replaced with a clear project, ensuring my children saw a mother strong, independent, and capable of turning pain into power. The revenge no one expected wasn't humiliation, it was metamorphosis. While he tried to erase my name, I rewrote it in cleared debts, peaceful nights, laughter with my children. I opened a small online business selling handcrafted items I always wanted to make, and 3 years later, I hired my first employee. That first salary I paid her was definitive. I no longer depended on anyone to exist. Messages from women inspired by my story poured in. They also sought legal help, rebuilt their lives, and gained strength. My revenge, the rebirth of a dignified life, reverberated beyond my personal case. Eventually, I learned he had left town quietly, seeking a new start. I didn't feel triumph, I felt relief and compassion. And me? I smiled, gave thanks, and moved forward. If anyone asks today, I say honestly, I was betrayed, robbed, abandoned. But I refused to be defined by it. I transformed pain into action, loss into strategy, despair into reconstruction. My revenge wasn't cinematic, it was patience, law, action, and above all, self-love. When people expected my failure, I gave them something else, a woman standing tall, her accounts in order, her dreams alive, her children safe. The days after discovering the empty account and the block on my phone felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Every attempt to reach him, every unanswered call and message, only deepened the shock. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, him leaving the house with a casual smile, like it was nothing, while in reality he was stealing everything that kept our life together, our savings, our security, our trust. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank screen of my phone, feeling as if the ground beneath me had disappeared. Panic turned to determination. I realized quickly that screaming or begging would solve nothing. I needed a plan, and the first step was understanding the damage. I went to the bank the next morning, trying to keep my voice calm, though inside I felt a storm. The teller listened patiently as I explained that large transfers had been made without my authorization. They took notes, filed a report, and promised to start an investigation. Even though the process would take time, it was a first step, a small thread of hope. But I knew that hope alone wouldn't be enough. I had to uncover the truth about what else he had done. I began tracking transactions, looking for anything unusual, anything that could give me leverage. I enlisted the help of a trusted friend, someone with knowledge of accounting, and together we started piecing together the puzzle. Every new piece of information was a punch to the stomach, revealing the extent of his betrayal. I discovered secret payments to unknown accounts, gifts to women I had never met, and expenses that contradicted everything he had ever claimed. The man I thought I knew had been living a double life right under my nose. Despite the anger bubbling inside me, I refused to act rashly. I could feel the temptation to lash out, to post, to shout my fury to the world, but I resisted. I realized that the most powerful response would not be public humiliation, it would be reclaiming my life piece by piece, brick by brick, until he had nothing left to control. I began documenting everything meticulously: screenshots, bank statements, notes on his patterns, and witnesses who had seen him at places he should not have been. Each night, I sat alone, going over the evidence again and again. The loneliness was heavy, but it also clarified my purpose. I started thinking strategically. Legal action was essential, yes, but so was personal empowerment. I opened a separate account for myself, changed all passwords, and ensured he had no access to anything. I contacted a lawyer discreetly and explained the situation, receiving guidance on how to move forward without compromising my own safety or credibility. Amidst the fear and uncertainty, I began to feel a spark of something I hadn't felt in years: control. For the first time since his betrayal, I realized that while he had taken my money, he could not take my mind, my strategy, or my dignity. I started planning not just how to recover what was lost financially, but how to reclaim my life entirely. Every decision was deliberate, every step calculated. I was no longer the frightened woman left behind. I was becoming a force he had underestimated completely. In the quiet of the nights that followed, I also began to rebuild my emotional strength. I sought therapy, reconnecting with old friends and leaning on my sister for support. I needed to fortify myself because the road ahead would require patience, courage, and discipline. I couldn't let anger cloud my judgment. It had to be transformed into clarity. By the end of the month, I had a clear picture of his betrayal: not just the money, but the deception, the hidden life, the manipulation. And I realized something important: the revenge no one expected wouldn't be a confrontation or a scandal. It would be my rise, my independence, my success while he scrambled to maintain a life built on lies. And so, piece by piece, I began to take back control. Every small victory: freezing accounts, documenting evidence, consulting experts, strengthened me. Every action was a step toward reclaiming my life, not as the woman he abandoned, but as the woman he had never truly understood. In that quiet, calculated rage, I discovered a truth more powerful than anger: the only revenge worth having is living your life so fully that no one can ever hurt you again. I started the third month like someone preparing for a long journey, not hurried, but resolute, with a map folded carefully in my pocket and enough provisions to survive whatever came. The lawyer had set the wheels in motion: preliminary injunctions, requests for transaction reversals, and formal notices to freeze anything that still bore my name. Those legal moves were necessary and reassuring, but I knew law alone wouldn't restore the life he helped unmake. I needed to be smarter than the situation. I needed a life plan. So I did what I'd never allowed myself to do before: I invested in me. I signed up for evening classes in bookkeeping and small business management, something practical that would empower me financially. I began taking on freelance work I'd avoided for years because the routine of family life had swallowed my ambitions. The first month was meager, more symbolic than profitable, but each deposit into my new account felt like a stitch closing an open wound. Money stopped being just numbers and became proof of a future I was building with my own hands. At the same time, I became methodical about peeling back the layers of his deception. I reached out quietly to people I suspected he'd been involved with, not to cause scenes, but to understand patterns. Some encounters confirmed my suspicions, others surprised me with their humanity. A woman who'd once been a name on a receipt met me in a cafe and spoke of promises she thought he'd made, then realized were empty. She didn't know me, she only knew she'd been used. Her apology to me for being an unwitting part of his life was awkward and unnecessary, but it helped close another small corner of my grief. It also reinforced my resolve that this would not be an ugly spectacle, it would be a dismantling of illusions, one reality at a time. Work with the bank moved at its own slow rhythm. There were bureaucratic hurdles, required affidavits, and meetings where men in suits used words that sounded designed to confuse. I learned to listen and then ask for plain answers. I learned to persist. When a clerk tried to minimize the urgency of a suspicious transfer, I calmly insisted on escalation. When an investigator called asking for more documents, I delivered them within hours. That persistence paid off. Small reversals were granted, an auto payment was suspended, and the bank placed temporary holds on 2 questionable accounts. It wasn't a clean sweep, but it kept food on the table and school supplies in Lucas's backpack. Emotionally, the terrain was jagged. There were mornings I woke with a surge of hope only to crash against the memory of his betrayal by noon. There were nights when I paced the kitchen, mouthing confrontations I would never staged in public. But those nights also became the nights I planned. I wrote lists, not of revenge but of recovery, steps to secure my children's future, paperwork to file, tax filings to update, clients to contact about freelance work. The lists gave me a rhythm, the rhythm gave me peace. In the middle of all this, I made a decision that surprised even me. I would not let the house define my next chapter. The mortgage was still in both our names, a tie that could drag me back into dependence if I wasn't careful. I met with a property lawyer and a financial advisor, and together we explored options. Selling felt like defeat, staying felt like tethering myself to his shadow. We arrived at a compromise. I would remain in the house for a defined period while I stabilized finances, but I also began exploring a small apartment nearby as a contingency, a symbol of independence more than necessity. The idea of one day packing my own boxes and walking away without regret fueled me more than anger ever did. Socially, the fallout continued to shift. Some friends who had been silent suddenly found their voices and reached out with support. Others who had once laughed with him now avoided my calls. That was painful at first. The thinning of familiar faces felt like another kind of loss, but it revealed something vital. The circle around me was now composed of people who could hold truth and grief and still love me. My sister became a fortress. Late-night calls with her were pragmatic and healing. "We'll get through this," she would say, and we meant it. I also began documenting everything more officially. I compiled a binder with dates, screenshots, bank records, notes from conversations, and witness statements. In the beginning it was a private ledger of my torment. By the end of the month it had the weight of a formal dossier. The act of putting things down on paper transformed chaos into evidence, and evidence would be the language of justice. Small victories kept me sane. The first time a client paid me directly into my new account, I allowed myself to imagine something larger than survival. When Lucas brought home a drawing of our family and labeled us team, I felt a swell in my chest that had nothing to do with money or papers. Those moments reminded me why every legal meeting and every sleepless night had worth beyond retribution. Then came the moment I had been preparing for in secret, a conversation with his employer that would shift the dynamics of power. I requested a meeting with HR, presenting not to smash him publicly but to show a pattern of behavior that could expose the company to liability, unauthorized expenses, possible embezzlement, and a lack of transparency that might harm stakeholders. I walked into that room calm and precise, a woman who knew her facts. The HR director listened, then took my documents with an expression that moved from curiosity to concern. I could see in her the recognition that this was bigger than marital conflict. It had financial and reputational implications for the firm. That conversation set things into motion in a way the bank's slow machinery had not. An internal audit was launched, questions were sent to him, and boundaries that had once protected him began to erode. I wasn't seeking to destroy his career for spite. I wanted accountability. And accountability, when applied correctly, can be a more damning force than gossip or scandal. In the quieter moments, I focused on parenting. I created new rituals with Lucas, a Saturday morning routine of pancakes and park time, an evening of reading that became our fortress of normalcy. I learned that the steadiness I offered him was itself a form of defiance against chaos. Children need constancy more than explanations, and I gave Lucas the routine that allowed him to thrive despite the tremors in our family foundation. As autumn turned into winter, small yet decisive changes accumulated. My freelance earnings grew. The bank returned a portion of the misappropriated funds to a legal escrow account for urgent expenses. the employer's investigation began to show signs that it would not be perfunctory. Each of these shifts removed a small piece of the control he once had. But the most profound change was internal. I no longer defined myself through his betrayal. I defined myself through actions, steps I chose, lessons I learned, and a future I sketched in careful strokes. One night, months into this new life, I stood on the balcony with a cup of tea and felt something unfamiliar and powerful: gratitude. Not for what he had done, but for the clarity his betrayal had forced upon me. It stripped away complacency and demanded that I fight for the life I wanted. I raised my cup to the dim lights of the city and promised myself that whatever came next would be on my terms. The plan was not vengeance for spectacle, it was a practical dismantling of the web of lies, and a deliberate reconstruction of a life that no one could ever take from me again. By the time winter fully settled, I had transitioned from reactive survival to proactive strategy. Every day became a series of deliberate steps: calls to the bank, emails to legal counsel, tracking expenditures, and quietly observing his patterns through the evidence I had meticulously collected. I had learned to separate emotion from action, to treat anger like fuel rather than a weapon. The more I documented, the clearer my path became. I was no longer the woman he could manipulate or intimidate. I was a careful architect, building a life that he could no longer touch. One morning, I received a message from HR at his company. They had begun a preliminary audit after reviewing the documents I submitted. The tone was neutral, professional, but underneath it was the unmistakable tension that comes when someone realizes that a trusted employee's behavior may have consequences. I felt a subtle thrill, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because accountability was beginning to manifest. The realization that my actions could force consequences without me raising my voice in public or creating a scene gave me a sense of control I had never felt before. At the same time, I continued my work on the financial front. With my lawyer's guidance, I requested detailed statements from the bank, challenging transfers he had made without my consent. There were obstacles: clerks who argued technicalities, investigators who wanted more documentation, but I had anticipated delays. Each new requirement became an opportunity to reinforce my position. Every affidavit signed, every screenshot printed, every witness statement obtained strengthened my standing. It was tedious, emotionally exhausting, but also empowering. For the first time in months, I realized that I was no longer a victim. I was an active participant in shaping outcomes. Amidst all of this, I began thinking about my own independence. The house we shared, while initially a place of refuge, had become a symbol of control. I made a plan to slowly untangle myself from the joint responsibilities that had tethered me to him. I started investigating options to refinance the mortgage solely in my name, even if that meant moving into a smaller apartment temporarily. Each decision was calculated. I was ensuring that my next steps would be irreversible and empowering. My social life also began to realign. Friends who had remained silent for years started to show support, offering advice and encouragement. Others, who had been closer to him, quietly withdrew. Though at first this thinning of my social circle was painful, it ultimately clarified who truly had my back. My sister became a constant presence. Late-night conversations were no longer just cathartic but tactical. Together, we would discuss next steps, review evidence, and plan responses. The network I had once taken for granted became a fortress around me. Lucas, observing my calm determination, began to sense the shift as well. I made sure that our routines were intact, that he felt the stability and love that had always defined our family. Weekends became our sacred time: pancakes on Saturday mornings, park visits, quiet evenings reading together. These rituals were small but profound acts of resistance against the chaos his father had unleashed. They reminded both of us that life could continue, even thrive, despite betrayal. As the months progressed, I began to feel a transformation that went beyond finances and legal matters. The woman who had once been uncertain, afraid, and dependent was now confident, decisive, and forward-looking. I started planning small projects I had abandoned years ago: freelance work, online classes, and eventually my own small business. Money started coming back, not as a token of recovery, but as proof of my autonomy. Every deposit into my new account, every contract secured, reinforced the notion that I could stand independently and thrive. The internal shift was even more profound than the external. I no longer allowed memories of his betrayal to dominate my thoughts. They became tools for clarity, not instruments of despair. Each reminder of his absence, each flash of past deceit, served to reinforce my vigilance and strategic thinking. I realized that true power didn't come from revenge in the traditional sense, it came from preparation, foresight, and the ability to rebuild stronger than before. Then came a breakthrough. Through careful monitoring, I discovered irregularities in one of his transactions that had gone unnoticed by both the bank and his employer. It was subtle, almost insignificant in isolation, but combined with the documentation I had compiled, it formed a pattern impossible to ignore. I immediately alerted both institutions, providing a full report and all supporting evidence. Within days, both the bank and HR confirmed they would escalate investigations. He had no idea that my meticulous research, patience, and determination had outpaced him entirely. By the end of the season, I had reached a stage where progress was undeniable. Partial restitution had been approved by the bank, legal proceedings were advancing steadily, and I had created a financial and emotional buffer that allowed me to focus on rebuilding, rather than surviving. I had turned the tables completely, not through confrontation, but through planning, intelligence, and resilience. That winter, I realized the deepest truth of my journey: the most effective revenge is not noise, spectacle, or vindictiveness. It is quiet, relentless, and self-affirming. It is the act of living fully and independently, of reclaiming your life with precision and purpose. Every document I filed, every account I secured, every step I took toward independence was a silent message: I was no longer under his control. He had underestimated me at every turn, and in doing so, he had forged the very resolve that would allow me to rise. And in those quiet moments, standing at my window with a cup of tea in hand, I understood something profound. The real power lay not in revenge as others imagine it, but in survival, clarity, and the deliberate reclamation of a life that had almost been stolen. The storm had passed, and what remained was strength, foresight, and a determination no betrayal could ever break. By early spring, the rhythm of my new life had settled into a pattern of cautious control. I woke each morning with a purpose that was entirely my own: emails to respond to, freelance work to manage, bank statements to review, and legal updates to track. Each step, no matter how small, reinforced the reality that I was no longer powerless. Every decision was a deliberate assertion of autonomy. I no longer waited for him to stumble or fail. I was actively building a life that could flourish with or without him. The bank continued its slow but steady progress. Each meeting with investigators became an exercise in precision. I supplied documents, answered questions, clarified discrepancies. Every correction they made to fraudulent transactions felt like reclaiming a piece of what had been stolen from me. And while the sums were significant, the real victory was symbolic. It was proof that I could assert control over the financial chaos he had unleashed. At the same time, the employer's internal review began to expose cracks in his professional image. Small discrepancies, once invisible, were now highlighted in official reports. I had never intended to destroy him, yet the consequences of his actions naturally unfolded. He tried subtle manipulations, excuses, partial confessions, attempts to charm colleagues, but the groundwork I had laid with evidence, dates, and meticulous records left him with nowhere to hide. It was an elegant kind of justice, natural, inevitable, and entirely rooted in accountability. Meanwhile, I focused on personal growth and rebuilding my future. I expanded my freelance projects, exploring niches I had once dismissed as too ambitious. I started a small online business selling handmade items, crafts, artwork, and designs I had always wanted to produce but never had the time or courage to pursue. Each order that arrived in my inbox, each customer message thanking me, reinforced the reality that I could thrive without him. The business was small, yes, but it was mine, and it symbolized far more than revenue. It was freedom manifest. Lucas, observing these changes, began to internalize the lesson I was teaching without even speaking it. He saw his mother as strong, decisive, and capable. He asked questions about money, business, and independence in a way he never had before. Our conversations about finances became teaching moments, discussions about responsibility became lessons in resilience. Watching him absorb these values gave me a sense of triumph that no courtroom or bank transaction could ever provide. Socially, the landscape continued to shift. Friends who had wavered were now clearly aligned with me. They became allies in subtle but meaningful ways, helping with advice, moral support, and practical guidance. People who had once doubted me or given him the benefit of the doubt gradually withdrew, leaving me with a circle of truth and trust. The thinning of my social sphere, once painful, now felt cleansing. It allowed me to focus my energy on people and actions that truly mattered. Then came a turning point that would accelerate everything. One afternoon, I received confirmation from the bank that the largest of the unauthorized transfers had been temporarily frozen and that part of the stolen funds would be returned to a legal escrow account. The relief was tangible. I could now cover Lucas's school expenses, our rent, and necessary living costs without relying on credit or borrowed funds. The sense of regained stability was intoxicating. I realized that the first layer of independence had been reclaimed, but there was still work to do. Determined to cement my position further, I began to explore opportunities for long-term security. I consulted a financial advisor to restructure my accounts, separate all assets, and plan investments that could grow without interference. Each meeting, each calculation, each plan made me feel more in control than I ever had before. The financial strategies I developed were not flashy, they were careful, precise, and aimed at resilience. I was no longer dependent on anyone, and that reality filled me with a quiet, profound satisfaction. The emotional work continued in parallel. Therapy sessions, journaling, and meditation became daily rituals. I processed not only the betrayal but also the fear, uncertainty, and anger that had gripped me for months. Each session added layers of clarity and perspective. I began to see my husband's actions not as defining events, but as catalysts for transformation. The pain remained, but it had been converted into purpose. By mid-spring, I was ready for the next step, accountability. I scheduled a meeting with a family lawyer to review options for formal proceedings, alimony, and restitution. The lawyer was impressed with the meticulous documentation I had compiled. Every screenshot, bank record, witness note, and email was organized, time-stamped, and cross-referenced. The process that could have been overwhelming became a demonstration of methodical precision. I realized, in that moment, that my meticulous planning was not just empowering me, it was forcing him into a position of vulnerability he had never anticipated. The legal actions were slow-moving but effective. Each court filing, each bank review, each company audit added layers of pressure. He reached out once or twice, attempting to negotiate privately, but I had learned the value of patience and boundaries. I replied only through formal channels. There was no drama, no spectacle, just steady, undeniable progress. As I navigated these challenges, I also nurtured my personal life. I spent evenings with Lucas, sharing stories, reading, and exploring the city on small adventures. I reconnected with old friends and formed new connections. My social network was no longer a reflection of his world, it was a reflection of mine, carefully curated, honest, and resilient. By the end of spring, tangible results began to appear. Part of the stolen funds were returned, legal filings moved forward, and his social and professional reputation showed subtle but undeniable cracks. And yet, the most important change was internal. I was no longer a victim waiting for external validation or justice. I was a woman who had reclaimed her life, step by step, with deliberate action and unshakable resolve. The revenge no one expected was no longer hypothetical, it was taking shape in reality. It wasn't dramatic or vengeful in the cinematic sense, it was deliberate, strategic, and empowering. Every choice I made, every action I took, built a life he could no longer control and a narrative he could not rewrite. And in that, I found not only satisfaction but the deep, steady confidence that I had finally regained everything that truly mattered, my freedom, my dignity, and my future. By early summer, I had settled into a rhythm that was both relentless and controlled. Every day was carefully structured, meetings with lawyers, correspondence with the bank, work on my fledgling business, time with Lucas, and deliberate attention to my emotional health. I had transformed chaos into routine, pain into planning, and betrayal into strategy. The woman who had once panicked at a blocked phone was now someone who anticipated, analyzed, and acted with precision. Each small step I took reinforced the reality that I was no longer under his shadow. The legal proceedings continued, slowly but inevitably moving in my favor. The bank finalized the reversal of several key transactions, transferring a substantial portion of the funds into a secured legal escrow account. This was not just money returned, it was a symbol of restored control, a foundation upon which I could rebuild and plan without fear of sudden disruption. With these funds, I began restructuring our lives. Lucas's school fees were secure, household expenses were manageable, and I had the first threads of independence I had not had in years. Meanwhile, the internal investigation at his company escalated. I had never sought to humiliate him publicly, but I had ensured that his choices had consequences. Subtle discrepancies that I had documented became undeniable patterns in the eyes of auditors. I provided supporting evidence, methodically, calmly, and without emotion, leaving no room for excuses or manipulation. Each meeting I attended with HR reinforced one simple truth: accountability was unavoidable when evidence was irrefutable. The tension that had once given him confidence began to erode. He realized, too late, that his actions had far-reaching consequences he could no longer control. As the weeks passed, my personal growth mirrored the legal and financial victories. I expanded my small business, creating a line of products I had once dreamed of selling but had never dared. Every order received, every positive review, reinforced my autonomy. The revenue was modest, but the symbolic weight was immense. Each sale represented independence, proof that I could create stability without relying on him. It was a tangible affirmation of my abilities, a reminder that my strength lay not in revenge, but in resilience and creativity. Lucas, observing these changes, absorbed more than I had anticipated. He saw his mother as capable, strong, and determined, qualities that inspired his own courage. Our evening reading sessions became lessons in problem-solving and morality. Our weekend routines became a fortress of stability and joy, reminding him that family could endure betrayal and still thrive. I realized that my empowerment was not just for myself, but also for him, shaping a foundation that would influence his values and future choices. Socially, the landscape continued to shift. Allies who had supported me in private were now openly affirming their loyalty and assistance, while those who had sided with him gradually withdrew. This refinement of my social circle, though initially uncomfortable, became a strategic advantage. My relationships were now built on trust, honesty, and shared values, providing both emotional and practical support. I learned that strength is often reflected not only in what you do alone, but in the network you cultivate around you. By midsummer, I was ready to intensify the final phase of strategic action. I began preparing formal legal documents for restitution, alimony, and damages. Each piece of evidence I submitted had been meticulously organized: transaction logs, bank statements, communications, witness statements, and supporting documentation of his hidden expenditures. I had transformed chaos into clarity, ensuring that each action I took could not be contested or dismissed. The process was not without tension. He reached out sporadically, attempting to negotiate privately, to sway opinions, or to intimidate indirectly through mutual acquaintances. Each attempt was met with silence or formal response. I had learned that true power comes not from reaction but from control, from maintaining boundaries and letting facts speak for themselves. He could attempt manipulation, but he could not undo the deliberate, evidence-based path I had constructed. Emotionally, I had reached a point I had never thought possible in the months following his betrayal. Therapy, journaling, and introspection had given me clarity and strength. I no longer felt consumed by anger or despair. I had converted those emotions into focus, strategy, and deliberate action. The woman who once felt helpless at a drained bank account had become someone unshakable, whose calm determination reshaped every circumstance in her favor. Then came the pivotal moment. The court finally scheduled a preliminary hearing for the case of misappropriation and restitution. I entered the courtroom with a sense of quiet confidence, carrying a binder filled with evidence and documents meticulously prepared over months. The room was hushed, anticipation lingering like a held breath. My husband entered, attempting a casual demeanor, but I could see the tension beneath the surface, the realization that the reality he had attempted to manipulate was now fully documented, undeniable, and irreversible. The proceedings unfolded methodically. Each piece of evidence I presented was acknowledged, corroborated, and unchallenged. The judge and legal counsel engaged with the facts directly, leaving little room for excuses. I remained calm, observing every reaction, aware that my preparation had shifted the balance of power entirely. For the first time in months, I felt that visceral sense of triumph, not from revenge, but from justice executed with precision. Outside the courtroom, life continued to flourish. My business expanded steadily, clients were consistent, and I had developed a financial buffer that allowed me to plan long-term stability. Lucas thrived in school, supported by the calm structure I provided. My social network was strong, supportive, and filled with individuals who valued integrity, honesty, and mutual respect. Internally, I realized the final truth of my journey so far. The real victory had never been about money, or humiliation, or revenge. It had always been about reclaiming autonomy, building resilience, and ensuring a future that no one could compromise. The betrayal, the deceit, and the theft had been catalysts, painful, yes, but they had forged a version of me capable of strategy, patience, and decisive action. By the end of summer, I was no longer just surviving, I was thriving. The legal and financial mechanisms I had implemented ensured protection and restitution. The personal growth I had cultivated provided strength and clarity. And the most satisfying truth of all was this: the woman who had been blindsided, betrayed, and abandoned had not only reclaimed her life but had done so in a manner that no one, not even him, could undermine or diminish. By late summer, the trajectory of my life had shifted irreversibly. Each day brought progress, partial restitution from the bank, advances in legal proceedings, growth in my fledgling business, and a sense of stability I had never experienced before. I no longer measured life in terms of what he had taken from me but in terms of what I had built for myself. Every call, every email, every small success reinforced an undeniable truth: I was no longer defined by his betrayal. The legal battle, which had begun as a reaction to his theft, had now become a controlled process. I had learned the rhythm of the system, the pace at which banks, courts, and corporate investigations operated, and I had structured my actions to anticipate delays, obstacles, and manipulations. The result was precision. Each filing, each document, each witness statement reinforced my position and eroded his. He had once assumed that silence, evasion, and deception would shield him. He had not counted on meticulous documentation, patience, and strategic foresight. Internally, I felt the full weight of transformation. The woman who had once trembled at a drained bank account had become someone capable of navigating complex systems with confidence. The chaos that had once threatened to swallow me had been replaced with structure. Where there had been fear, there was now clarity. Where there had been anger, there was strategic determination. Each step forward reinforced the sense that I was not merely surviving but actively reclaiming my life, piece by piece. At home, Lucas was thriving. He had become more observant, more self-assured, and more resilient, likely influenced by the stability and example I provided. Our routines, once disrupted by crisis, had solidified into rituals of security and growth. Evenings of reading and storytelling became exercises in empowerment, subtly teaching him the value of resilience, patience, and intelligence. I realized that my revenge, in the truest sense, was not directed outward. It was the creation of an environment in which he could no longer exert control over us. The financial picture continued to improve. My business was no longer just a symbolic assertion of independence, it had become a reliable source of income. Freelance work supplemented earnings, and the escrowed restitution provided by the bank allowed me to stabilize the household, pay off lingering debts, and plan for future investments. Each dollar recovered was a tangible affirmation of the larger victories I had orchestrated. Meanwhile, the social fallout for him became apparent. The internal investigation at his company had exposed discrepancies that could not be ignored. Subtle changes in colleagues' behavior, questions from management, and documented inconsistencies all contributed to an environment in which he could no longer operate unchecked. I did not actively seek to ruin him, but the consequences of his choices became unavoidable. This quiet, indirect form of accountability was more powerful than any public confrontation could have been. The final pieces of my strategy focused on legal consolidation and long-term independence. With my lawyer, I prepared comprehensive filings to ensure that restitution, alimony, and damages would be legally binding. I had compiled everything necessary: detailed transaction histories, documented communications, corroborating witness statements, and expert analyses. Nothing was left to chance. I approached this not with malice but with meticulous care, understanding that true power lies in preparation and evidence rather than emotion-driven confrontation. As autumn approached, I sensed the final shift in momentum. The court had begun scheduling hearings that would address the remaining disputes in a decisive manner. I attended each session with quiet confidence, presenting evidence clearly and calmly. My husband's attempts to intervene or manipulate were rendered ineffective. He could not navigate the structure and precision I had established. Each interaction in the courtroom reinforced a deeper truth. I was no longer reacting, I was orchestrating. In parallel, I nurtured my personal life and emotional well-being. Therapy sessions continued, providing space to process residual pain and to reinforce resilience. Social connections strengthened, now composed entirely of people whose support was genuine and reliable. I devoted time to creative projects, business development, and parenting, allowing each area to flourish without interference. The combination of practical progress and personal growth created an unshakable foundation for the life I was building. And then came the moment I had envisioned for months: tangible, undeniable justice. The bank completed its investigation and released the majority of the escrowed funds, ensuring immediate financial stability. The court issued preliminary orders for restitution, alimony, and compensation for moral and financial damages. The company audit concluded, confirming discrepancies and placing professional consequences squarely in his path. In each case, my preparation had ensured that there could be no denial, no avoidance, and no shortcuts. Accountability had arrived in full force. Standing outside the courtroom that day, I felt a profound sense of liberation. The legal, financial, and personal victories were undeniable, but the most important transformation was internal. I was no longer defined by his betrayal, nor by fear, nor by loss. I was defined by my strategic action, resilience, and ability to reclaim control. The revenge no one expected had not been a dramatic spectacle or public shaming. It had been careful, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. It had been the reclamation of my life, my autonomy, and my dignity. By the end of Part 7, I had realized a truth deeper than justice or restitution. The most powerful form of revenge is self-empowerment. By reclaiming my life, finances, and emotional stability, I had removed his influence entirely. He could not undo what I had rebuilt, and he could not diminish the strength, clarity, and independence I had cultivated. The woman who had been blindsided, betrayed, and abandoned had emerged transformed, resilient, and fully in control of her destiny.